Well, good afternoon, and thanks again for joining another episode of the Texas Public Policy Foundation Monday live stream. Each week we try to cover the most timely issues of the day. And whether you have school-age children or not, the most pressing question facing America right now, regardless of where you live, what you think about politics, is whether our schools will reopen. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Emily Sass, whom I'll introduce formally here momentarily, our good friend, Dr. Corey DeAngelis, and we're going to address that question. Should schools reopen in person wherever you are? We have many people tuning in from outside Texas. Right here in the People's Republic of Austin, we can tell you that in Texas, this is a major question. And ultimately, what we're going to be driving home today is using data to inform really good decisions. And at the base of those good decisions, the foundation for those good decisions is a really radical concept, which is that parents should make that decision for their families and for their students. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest. If we've not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Kevin Roberts. I'd serve as the executive director of this organization. We have our good friend, Dr. Corey DeAngelis, joining us from the nation's capital. Corey, if you don't know, is someone who is a major voice in education reform on behalf of families and students. He's the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation, also serves as adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He holds his PhD from the University of Arkansas in education policy, and a native Texan, right, Corey, from San Antonio.
Yep.
Earned his first 2 degrees from the University of Texas at San Antonio. It's great to have you with us, and we'll get started with our questions shortly. But I would be remiss if I did not introduce the young lady sitting here with me, Emily Sass, who, in spite of her youth and her optimism, is a very seasoned policy expert. She's one of our senior policy leaders here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. In fact, she's the policy director for our Next Generation Texas issue campaign, which encapsulates anything having to do with young people. Emily is in charge of that. She holds a bachelor's in music from Thomas Edison State University, a certificate in education finance from Georgetown, and is a trained classical musician and a former teacher. Emily, thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in, folks. We have this situation all across the country. Obviously, Emily, you and I are paying attention to what's going on in Texas most. But Corey, you've been vocal about this issue, which is whether schools should reopen in person. We have 2 seeming competing goods. On the one hand, we want to keep kids and teachers and families safe, in particular from the coronavirus, but I might add from everything else that might infect us, right? And on the other hand, we know that it's really good for a whole bunch of reasons for schools to reopen. Now, that isn't to say that virtual education is bad. We just want to be sure that parents have the choice, that it isn't the system making that choice. Just on a very high level, Corey, I just want you to tackle this question for people interested in this policy about what's at stake regarding schools reopening this fall.
Yeah, I mean, my main argument has been that we shouldn't force all schools to reopen from the top down, but we should not force families to pay for closed schools either. So you're right that there are these competing interests here on either side of the debate. And, the taxpayers are rightly concerned that they're paying for a service that isn't being provided or is at least proposed to not being provided in the fall. So that's a huge issue there. And families have structured their whole lives around the K-12 education system, and how it's been set up traditionally is that it's served for educational purposes, but then also for allowing them to have both parents go out to work, or if you're in a single parent household, allowing you to go out to work and kind of outsource that childcare service to the K-12 education system. And all of a sudden, a lot of states are talking about not having that particular benefit ingrained into the K-12 education system. And so that's why we're having this, huge argumentation on either side about what should happen, because the taxpayers and the families are rightly concerned that they want to get back to work. They want to be able to provide for their families, and they want to be able to have that service provided to their children as well, and being able to get that kind of education. And I will say it's a particularly contentious debate when it comes to schooling and not any other industries, because of that entrenched interest that we have in keeping the system as it currently is today. And in particular, it has to do with the funding mechanism. just imagine if your neighborhood Walmart didn't reopen, or you're in Texas, so your neighborhood HEB didn't reopen. And I loved going to HEB when I was growing up in San Antonio. We don't have that here in DC, which is a tragedy. But look, if your neighborhood HEB didn't reopen, and they could come up with a lot of reasons for why they didn't want to reopen for their employees or for their customers, and they just they didn't feel like it was the right decision to reopen at the time. It would be pretty inconvenient for people in the neighborhood because, that's their preferred store, but it wouldn't be devastating to families because, one, they wouldn't have to continue paying HEB for groceries that weren't delivered to their families. And then, two, they could pick to go to Walmart or Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or some other grocery store without having that devastate their family. They still be able to provide those goods and services to their families. And you can imagine if it was set up a little differently where HEB got your money each week, even if they didn't reopen, there would be a whole different incentive system aligned for them they would have a very weak incentive to reopen in a timely manner or an effective manner. They'd have a much stronger incentive to put off reopening just because they'd know that they'd still get your money regardless. And, this has been seen with the differences between private schools and public schools as responding to the pandemic. And the private schools have had a much better response. And I would argue it's because they know that their customers can walk away and take their money with them and force the schools to close down if they don't respond to the closures and the reopening situation accordingly.
Well, it's obvious from your response, Corey. It's obvious to three of us, probably to a lot of our listeners, but maybe someone tuning in who hasn't thought a lot about the implications that what's obvious is this will affect society writ large, right? That is this being the decision to reopen schools and what shape that takes. And it's not only just what happens this semester in the school year, but also what's going to happen for the next generation. I think for those of us who are educators, and regardless of whatever our political or ideological dispositions are, and I'll say this for our friends left of center, we all care deeply about children. We care deeply, most of all, about their well-being. We then care deeply about the education they receive. We might all have quibbles across the political spectrum about what school choice looks like, what kind of funding public schools get. But the point is that what's at stake here, not using any hyperbole, is the well-being of children and their families. And so it's that point, Emily, that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, especially over the last several days, as this issue of reopening schools has become the issue here in Texas and in states across the country. From a family perspective, depending upon what a school district is doing, whether they're going to reopen in person, only go to online education, or have some sort of hybrid, from a family perspective, what's at stake there?
I mean, you're talking about what Corey said, that people plan their entire lives around the schools that they're going to attend. They buy their homes based on the district that their child's going to attend. They buy homes in particular areas so that their child can go to a particular elementary or middle school within that district. Everything's planned with schools in mind. And as Corey mentioned, the way we've delivered education for well over 100 years now and beyond has been in person in a physical classroom on site. That's the way our Texas education system is set up. So we're in the unusual position of a few months ago, or even last year, the education system in Texas was insisting that education must be provided in person, and we could not offer expanded virtual options for families who wanted that in Texas. And we were having to fight to try to expand virtual options for families in Texas. And now it's flipped. We find ourselves in the unusual position of saying, yes, virtual options are important. They should be available to families, but we also need in-person options for families as well. As we all, many of us who've been following education policy know, the American Association of Pediatricians came out recently and said, the starting point should always be to try to have an in-person environment for students. We should make that our starting goal. If it can't be for some reason, let's make it as short as possible. Let's get those kids back into a social environment where they can be around people, having in-person interactions with teachers. There are students who may not want that on a continuing basis, but by and large, I mean, we know across the country, even in states with better virtual education policies in Texas, about 1 to 2% of students have chosen that as an ongoing educational approach. The overwhelming majority of students in Texas are going to need and want continued in-person interaction. And we need to make sure that we're providing that as well. We can't just do a 180 on families and say, psych, we've done in-person education for a couple hundred years, but now we're just going to switch to virtual on you. And we required in-person, that's all we were going to give you. And now virtual is all we're going to give you. Families can't handle that kind of a switch and be able to maintain their family structure, their jobs,
Sure.
Everything else. Go ahead, Corey.
And I think, Emily, you hit the nail on the head that there are a lot of families who may like virtual learning, but there are a lot of families who are relying on that in-person environment for their children. And what it all comes down to is it needs to come down to the individual decisions of the individual families. A lot of different states, probably Texas included, is talking about whether we're going to allow individual school districts to choose whether to reopen or not. And I think that's great. I think individual school districts should be able to make that choice based on their differing local conditions and their local knowledge about what's going on in their communities. But then we should take that same logic a step further and allow individual families to make that decision, to make those local decisions and using that local knowledge for their own family unit and what works best for their own family. So that could be a traditional school option. It could be a virtual school option. It could be something even like a micro school where you get into a group of 5 to 10 students in a household. But it's really hard to do that if you're from a disadvantaged family and you are relying on multiple incomes to provide for your families, and you're being forced to fund the education system and not allow those dollars to follow your child to wherever they're getting an education. I mean, just think about if we funded any of these other taxpayer-funded programs like this. Just think about food stamps. Just think about if the government said that, well, you live in this particular house, and if you want to use your food stamps, you have to go to this residentially assigned government-run grocery store. Everybody would think that would be ridiculous. And, rightly so, in the environment that we have today in the current system, families, the money goes to the families, and families can pick to take that money to Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, HEB, since you're in Texas. And we do the same thing with other educational programs too. Pell Grants at the higher education level. The money goes to the student, and the student can take it to Texas State, University of Texas, San Antonio, but you can also take it to privately run universities in your state as well. So we should just do the same thing with K through 12 institutions. And when we start looking at all these other analogies of other programs, it just doesn't really make sense. And it leaves families powerless in the current education system. And I'll say it again, it's the main reason why we're having so much of a fight around the school reopening debate. Because, if I had the money to send my child wherever they would be getting an education, I wouldn't worry if my local school district reopened or not. I mean, if I really wanted my child to go to the local school, maybe I'd worry about it a little bit, but it wouldn't be devastating again. I'd be able to send my child to the private school or a micro school option, or I'd be able to use that funding to offset the cost of homeschooling too, if I needed to.
Well, and that's really the key problem, we think, with school districts making the decision that instruction will only be online, right? It isn't that we have a problem with virtual instruction. We as school choicers, we believe in all of the above, right? And let the parents decide based on all of the factors that go into an individual family's decision making. But here in Texas and many states around the country, we see school districts making the decision for parents. And I think the way you framed it, Corey, was really astute. And not to get too academic, but it's what philosophers call the principle of subsidiarity, right? That the lowest possible unit make the decision, the unit closest to the actual decision. Well, school districts are halfway there, right? If they want to claim that they've got the authority instead of the state or the federal government to make that decision, then using the same logic, we then know that families have that right. To play devil's advocate, however, and we know we'll have at least several people tuning in who would disagree with this position, and I say that with a slight sarcastic smile, but with great respect, having been in this as y'all have been for many years. They would say, look, the threat from COVID-19 is so significant that school districts need to be making that decision. We had a conversation in this live stream last week, which pushed back on that some, but I do think it's fair for us to engage that question, that if you're a teacher and you're concerned about that, how would you respond to this claim that the three of us are making that families should make the decision regardless? Emily?
I mean, I think, again, we need to rely on individual choice. If a teacher's not comfortable returning to the classroom, why, again, are we requiring teachers to only teach within a certain format? If a teacher prefers not to be in that in-person structure, perhaps they can consider teaching within a private school that's set up some good safety restrictions, or setting up a micro school for students like Corey was talking about. Again, if we're restricting families, we're also restricting teachers in the same way. Teachers are feeling like they're backed into a corner because this is the only education structure that the state is willing to support. So if we would allow families greater freedom, we would also be allowing teachers greater freedom in choosing the way that they're going to provide instruction. Right now, nobody has control over those decisions beyond the school board level.
Yeah, I don't mind what the individual districts choose. I don't mind what individual teachers choose, as long as you take the next step and allow individual families to choose. And again, to respond to the heart of the question is, I mean, I'll just double down and say that families have the most information about this. The bureaucrats at the school districts don't have the best information about this, and they arguably don't have the best interests of the child in mind. I would argue that the families are more likely to have the best interests of the child in mind. So those decisions, again, should be in the hands of the people closest to those children, which are the parents and the families involved with those children, not the bureaucrats sitting at the traditional school district. So that's my quick response.
No, I think both of you are articulate about it, and we're going to continue for the next several minutes, sort of peeling back the layers of this onion and sort of the origins of what I would call just a hard-headedness by the system when it comes to allowing families and students to make decisions for themselves. It also, by the way, as you said very well, Emily, is connected to not allowing teachers, especially great teachers, to innovate in the classroom. And you know that from your classroom experience too. But after we do that, we want to let those of you who've tuned in who are parents looking for solutions this fall. I mean, this is imminent. You know this from where you live. You know that, Corey. I know it from parents where my wife and I live who are talking about this over the weekend. They're concerned about what their kids are going to be learning this fall. We're going to offer some solutions. But before we do that, we just have to finish peeling back the onion. So I'm intrigued, Corey, by something the two of you have mentioned a little bit, and it may be a little bit of a new concept for some of our audience, and that's the micro school. So explain that to us.
Yeah, it's kind of like outsourcing the process of homeschooling. A lot of people will argue that they cannot homeschool adequately because they have both parents in the household that need to go to their jobs, or maybe they're a single parent household and they're going to their job and they cannot do the process of watching the child throughout the day. So what you do is get a few families together and essentially outsource that process of homeschooling and get 5 to 10 students into a household together, something that you can call a micro school. And all you really need is one or two teachers or guides in that household or micro school to facilitate the learning of the students. And it tends to be more student-led and student-centered and student-driven learning going on. And you have the guide there to watch the child and make sure the child is safe, and to make sure if they have any questions about the lessons, so that they can answer these questions and help facilitate the learning. But it's really a super student-driven approach. It could be structured in a way to where the learning is more structured and it's more one-on-one instruction. But what we've seen with micro schools is it's much more student-centered, as it would be in a homeschooling environment or even an unschooling environment. And so you can cut out a lot of the costs of the education system associated with doing that as well, because you don't need all the bureaucracy and all the administrative bloat associated with educating those children. And I've kind of put some numbers together on Twitter just the other day. It actually went pretty viral. I think it's been viewed over 1.5 million times. But just think about it. In the United States, we spend $15,424 per child per year. It might be a little different in Texas, or maybe close. But if you multiply that out to a micro school with 10 children, that's over $150,000 in revenues going to that micro school. Let's just say that the teacher only got to, keep about 2/3 of that funding and 1/3 of it went to overhead. That's still around $100,000 and much more than what teachers make on average in the school system. And their class size is only around 10 students. And so they have more autonomy, smaller class sizes, higher salaries. And so this is something that highlights that school choice can benefit teachers too, by allowing the dollars to go to the families and more directly allowing those dollars to get to the teachers who are in high demand. So this can benefit families, students, and teachers at the same time. And so, this really highlights that school choice can benefit teachers too.
Mm-hmm.
So just to highlight, you've got smaller classrooms, experienced teachers, individualized learning, and kids still get the social environment of being in school with their friends. And if somebody listening to this is thinking, oh no, but won't that reduce, what if that would harm teachers? Under this model, you would actually need more teachers in the American education system, not the system as we think of it now, but there would be more teachers teaching if this were adopted widely, because you have more teachers teaching a smaller number of students.
And go ahead, Corey.
The problem is you don't have as much administrators and superintendents involved in the system. So there may be losses somewhere in the system, but it's definitely not being, it wouldn't be accrued to the teachers. They'd be absorbing essentially the superintendents and the administrator salaries, which is a good thing for teachers if you're on the side of supporting teachers in the education system in Texas.
Well, and just to weave in one of those really difficult truths about the education system into this forward-thinking optimism that the two of you have, we have seen in the last 25, 30 years in American education, administrative bloat. So just the money, the percentage of each dollar spent on administrative positions increased dramatically, frankly, both at the K-12 and higher ed levels. It's one of the problems from the standpoint of people who spent time in the classroom. So in fact, it's a very pro-teacher position as well to be talking about this innovation. I've got one more practical question about micro schools for the two of you. And just assume that there are moms and dads out in the audience really intrigued by this. How do you go about starting this? Corey?
Yeah, I mean, Google is your friend. So the way I would do it is to look up, look up existing micro schools. They already have groups that are available. So look up existing micro schools and homeschool co-ops in your area. And one place that I've seen that's very beneficial on Facebook, at least, even since, before the pandemic started, tens and thousands of families have been getting together on social media. There's a Facebook group called Learn Everywhere. You can search for that, or even go on to your keyboard and type into the hyperlink learneverywhere.org. You'll be able to find more information there as well. There's tons of resources available to families. And it's kind of this almost spontaneous order that kind of started as parents were looking for more options. Tons and tons of parents just spontaneously came together in these social media groups. And that's one of the best ways to figure out how to do this. And I also want to point out really quickly on the question of micro schools that outlets like Washington Post have been covering this, and they've been calling them like pandemic pods and, homeschool co-ops. And they've been pointing out a problem that is a potential problem with this, is that they're arguing that families doing this and schools not reopening will lead to further inequities in the education system. And I say, okay, yeah, you're right that the most advantaged families will be more likely to be able to kind of form these groups and be able to cover these costs while still paying their property taxes for schools that aren't even open. But they're failing to take the next step and propose the obvious solution, which is to allow the education dollars to follow the student so that less advantaged families can, use their $15,000 or however much it is in your state to be able to offset the cost of micro schooling. They'd be able to afford a lot more options. So Washington Post and other outlets need to take the next step in that logic sequence and figure out the right solution, which is school choice.
Well, they do. And for audience members who remain, in spite of your articulate response there, skeptical of that claim, I would point them to a wonderful but disturbing article in the Wall Street Journal the last few days, maybe Thursday or Friday of last week, which focused on schools in Jackson, Mississippi, predominantly African-American students. And I'm just going to say, from the standpoint of a fifth generation teacher, it is abhorrent what the system there is doing for underprivileged students. It is abhorrent that the system is standing in the way of innovation that, in fact, would have a disproportionately positive effect on the students who need it most. Those are the students we really need to be caring most about. Mm-hmm. So, Emily, you're a former teacher. I know we have some teachers in our audience. Corey's done a great job of explaining how you go about finding more information on microschools if you're a parent. What if you're a teacher and you say, okay, I get it. I've had enough. I'm tired of the system. It's so ridiculous. You're a teacher. How do you go about starting a microschool?
It's funny. I've been seeing teachers comment on this process on social media, and one of the responses has been, I'm kind of afraid to touch this because I'm afraid if it gets out, then I'll be punished by my school district. What if I lose my job just for entertaining this question? So I've heard of teachers being approached by parents who are interested, and then they're having to make that choice. If a teacher is interested in this, especially if a teacher isn't wanting to head back into the normal classroom, has kind of made this decision, I'm not going back that direction. I'm interested in exploring my other options. Then I think the teacher could go to the same sites like Learn Everywhere and start saying, hi, I'm in this area. I'm interested in teaching this many kids. This is my area of expertise. There are also sites that have offered tutoring services for a long period of time. And Erin Valdez, who does workforce development with us, has talked about this before. She used to use these online platforms as well, where a teacher can sign up and offer services there. I'm guessing that we're going to see the offering of services on sites like that expand immensely from just, well, I'll tutor your math to, I can tutor math in multiple grade levels, or I can cover multiple grade subjects at once. I'm a fourth grade teacher, I can do all of it, that kind of response. So teachers have multiple options available to them. They could offer on pre-existing sites and just widen their circle of services, or reach out on social to the families that are already looking for options. Or if they've already got, say, a circle of families they think might be interested, then they could, of course, reach out to those families directly and say, I'm considering what might the interest be in this. If you're interested, let me know. Here's how I would expect it to be set up. And of course, the teacher, in that situation is in the driver's seat. I'm willing to have students in person, but I'm going to expect their families to abide by these protocols.
Right.
It really puts these teachers and parents in the driver's seat to figure out what's best for this circle of students.
And it comes back to individual choice, right? By the teacher, by the parents. And I'll just say that, as I know you, Emily, and Corey know, micro schools have been around, really forever, if you think about it, but especially the last 25 or 30 years as we've seen some things like the homeschooling movement take off, there have always been these sort of hybrid scenarios between homeschooling and a public school classroom, all of them good in the sense that we're letting parents make that choice. So really appreciate the detail that the two of you have offered here, because we want to give our audience members some details about how they go about it. I'll say one more thing about micro schools for teachers. I've encouraged teacher friends, including some family members who are teachers, to do this just as an experiment while you've got a little extra time. Go on Facebook, go on Twitter, go on Instagram, wherever you are in social media, and just say, I'm a teacher. Say, if you are certified teacher in fourth grade or high school English teacher, I'm thinking about offering an alternative. And you can use the phrase micro school, or you can explain it a different way. And I just defy you not to be overwhelmed by the responses.
Yeah.
The demand by parents all across this country, all across the political spectrum, is overwhelming.
And one thing I should add here, it doesn't have to be a single teacher offering these services. This already exists in different forms. It's just been a boutique service for families up to this point. There's no reason why an English teacher, a math teacher, and a social studies teacher, and perhaps other subjects couldn't get together and say, we work well together, we've known each other, we have these priorities in our teaching, and we're going to offer these services as a package together. So kids will come and get English one day, math another day, or we'll offer it all together at the same time. You can bring more teachers into this setup if you want. The variety here is really endless. It's hard to capture everything that you could do here, but teachers could also partner together, just like families could partner together.
Yeah, so they could essentially establish like a miniature school with multiple teachers teaching different subjects. And I also want to point out there are actually micro school networks in different states, and I don't know the ones in Texas in particular, but in Arizona, for example, they have Prenda micro schools. So teachers can already sign up for this existing micro school network. I think there's also Acton Academy that's trying to set up micro school networks as well. So I would recommend going and checking those out. But there's also a new app called unschool.school. So if you go into your URL and just type in unschool.school, it'll take you to an almost like Uber-like, Airbnb-like service provider where it links education service providers, educators, with students. And it's almost like the Airbnb of education. And I think it's kind of the future of education. And I think that could be the next breakthrough in the future of education. And I think that could help teachers at this time link up with these families to be able to make some extra cash on the side. And that's just another additional alternative to the micro school concept. It's kind of similar, but it's more of this kind of app-like future technology that I would recommend checking out. And to get onto that point of, administrative bloat in the education system, I just want to point out one statistic from Kennesaw State University's Ben Scafferty. He put the data together on this for each state and the U.S. overall, and he found that between 1992 and 2014, real inflation-adjusted per pupil education expenditures in the United States actually went up by 27% in real terms, but teacher salaries in real terms dropped by 2%. So where's all the money going? It's going to administrative bloat. He also found that it's going to just hiring more and more support systems and support teachers instead of or support staff instead of allocating the dollars to the teacher salaries. And so that's good for teachers' union dues because it increases the amount of due paying members. And it also increases the amount of political power they have in numbers with the teachers' unions, but it doesn't actually benefit teachers by increasing their real-time pay. So that's a stat I'd like to point out to everybody thinking about this question. And again, it gets to the point that school choice can benefit teachers too, because one, you can cut out all the excessive bloated spending, but then you can also give schools strong incentives to spend money wisely, and that is where it's most wisely spent in the classroom on the students and with the teachers, the most important and valuable aspect of the K-12 education system. So again, we need to get away from this notion that somehow school choice is, either anti-public school or anti-teacher. It's nothing's further from the truth.
And in fact, if we embrace it, especially in light of current circumstances, I think teachers and parents and students, and maybe eventually administrators, many of whom started in the classroom, would come to see that, in fact, the school choice movement is very much a pro-public school movement, because the public school system has become what nothing should become, which is a system. It's not, making that observation is not at all anti-teacher or anti-public schools. In fact, we need to introduce more innovation into that. And I would just say teacher to teacher, I talk with teachers every day. I lament that most of them disagree with that statement, but we try to keep our conversations as respectful as we can. Sometimes it's hard, especially if they're towing the line of the teachers union, a point we're going to come back to. But I say, look, just teacher to teacher, you and I both know that money is not being spent well by the system. And if we spend it better for students, then we're spending it better for you as a teacher. And we ought to honor the sacrifices you're making as a teacher, materially, the sacrifices you make, in terms of time, buying your own resources. We don't, in the school choice movement at all, do anything other than want to honor that great sacrifice, that great commitment that teachers have, their love for young people, their love for this country. But the problem is when it becomes a system. And so that leads me to one final question that I'll ask the two of you. And I say this not to poke the bear, but the bear in this case is the series of teachers unions. And they deserve to be poked because they're standing in the way, not just of innovation, which is kind of an abstract concept, but they're standing in the way of kids learning. And I just wonder if both of you might take a few minutes to explain for our audience the worst examples of that kind of abuse, but also if you think these circumstances might lead to a solution. Emily?
So across the country, including in Texas, we're seeing teachers unions and education unions writ large, not just teachers unions, take steps to respond to the calls to reopen. Again, it's just you were mentioning, we're looking at one-size-fits-all solutions here. The administrators are kind of locked into a terrible situation too, because somehow they have got to find the magic one-size-fits-all solution for every kid in their district. Otherwise, somebody's going to be unhappy. Teachers, parents, family, some parents are all virtual all the way. How dare you bring kids in that might be Petri dishes for my community, and others are like, how dare you let this virus get in the way of allowing my kid to have a normal childhood. So I mean, they're trying to do the impossible. So kudos to them. I can't imagine. But along with this, we've got unions advocating for, if they can't find the perfect solution, if they can't offer that perfect solution to all families, then no other solution should be allowed to exist. So what we're seeing in Texas counties is some areas that don't want to reopen within the TEA timeframes that have been set are calling on public health officials for the county to ban in-person school through public health orders for a certain period of time, not just for public schools, so that those public schools can continue to get funding because it comes through a public health order, but also for all private schools in the area, in order to make sure that the competition can't open safely or unsafely. No one, if we're not offering school, no one can offer school. That's what's happening here in Texas. That conversation is still ongoing. Fortunately, the Attorney General did just release an opinion end of last week, highlighting that if you're putting that kind of limits on at least religious private schools, you are inhibiting their freedom of religion, because they actually have religious services as part of their daily instruction and interaction with students. But that's still an open question. What's going to happen? Are they going to be successful in shutting down private schools in order to defend what they're doing in the public sector?
Right.
And Corey, I know you know about situations across the country. I mean, LA USD comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from a competitive standpoint to shut down the competition, right? You can't have the private schools open, because then everybody will see that it's, if the private schools are doing it, why can't the public schools open as well? So, it's a perfectly rational decision for groups to be, fighting to shut down their competition. Of course, they're going to do that. But here's some examples from a lot of other places throughout the country. Milwaukee did something similar, where they're making it illegal to even go to private schools. As most people know, in the school choice movement, Milwaukee has had a private school voucher program for around 3 decades now. So now students using that voucher program essentially can't access schools either way, even though they've already been able to exit the public school system. Now the city's, closing down the private schools too, whereas they're still allowing, amusement parks to be open, spas, gyms, exercise facilities, and a whole bunch of other, social interaction, activities occurring, but not schools. And even daycare centers are allowed to be open, but not private schools, which doesn't make a lot of sense. In Oregon, this was probably one of the worst locations. If you're, trying to think about how you should respond to a pandemic and take care of families, don't do what Oregon did. That's probably the best example of what not to do. Wall Street Journal just wrote about this like a month or 2 ago, but the teachers unions actually lobbied and successfully lobbied to make it illegal to switch to virtual charter schools. So during the pandemic, a lot of families were scrambling and trying to figure out where to go. And they saw that, there's these virtual charter schools that have been doing this for decades. My public school has no idea what the heck they're doing, because, and rightfully so, they're trying to scramble to figure something out and try to cobble together some remote learning plan, and it's just not working. So we're going to try to switch to these virtual schools. Nope. Teachers union lobbied and successfully lobbied to block students. Wall Street Journal's article quoted one particular virtual school that already had, within a week of the order, 1,600 students were blocked from switching to that one virtual school in that one state. And that's totally ridiculous. You had other states like Pennsylvania, their superintendents association lobbied for the same thing as Oregon. They didn't get that, but they got the next best thing in their view, which was to block the funding from following the families to the virtual schools. So in Pennsylvania, it's legal technically to switch to the virtual schools if they'll take you, but none of that funding follows you. So the government-run school or the district school system gets to keep your funding, and that makes it as costly as possible to serve these families in times of need. California most recently followed Pennsylvania's actions, and while it's still legal to switch to virtual charter schools in California, the funding doesn't follow the student. So what that does is reward bad schools, and it punishes good schools, because if you're losing a lot of students, you have the same amount of revenues, but you have a lot less cost associated with educating this population, because you're not able to educate the kids anymore. So you actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis if you're losing students, and it's the opposite if you're gaining students. So the incentives are totally backwards in California and Pennsylvania right now. Los Angeles, we saw the Los Angeles teachers unions. They successfully made a deal with the district during the pandemic to only require teachers to teach for 4 hours a day during the pandemic. And those 4 hours could include things like grading papers, and you weren't required to actually lecture to your students during the pandemic. And the LA teachers union most recently, this was seen most recently in the news pretty much everywhere. I think one of the biggest articles was in the Daily Caller, but the teachers union, the UTLA, said that they didn't want to reopen, or they weren't going to reopen unless they had all these other seemingly unrelated policies like defunding the police, Medicare for all, and a whole bunch of these other, non-education related policies. And then also, most importantly, we're not going to reopen unless you shut down the charter school sector as well, shut down our competition. I mean, they're just really laying it out on the table of what this is really about. It's about shutting down their competition and protecting their monopoly stranglehold that they have. Two more quick examples. North Carolina most recently did something very similar to Los Angeles, where they said they want all these other, reforms to go into place before they open again. I think Medicare for all was on there, and there might have been something about, funding immigrants and giving them incomes, which I don't know how that's related to. And I'm for, more, open immigration. I'm a libertarian, so we might not want to talk too much about that, but this seems unrelated to getting the education system back open. So it seems like they're just kind of including whatever policies that they like at the moment into the deal. And then Alaska, their teachers union opposed a move to partner with Florida Virtual School to provide education to families during the pandemic. The state actually did it. They successfully partnered with Florida Virtual School, which has been doing this for decades successfully with families. But the union came out and said, I can't believe you did that. We oppose this move. So there's been tons of this all across the country.
So if I were writing a headline, Corey and Emily, it would be, this is why we're on the brink of a parent rebellion, right? The parents are up to what's going on.
Yeah. They're getting to see all of this fighting going on, and they're being left out of the conversations. They're getting the short end of the stick. They have been getting the short end of the stick. Emily and you and I have known this for forever, that families have been left out of the conversation, but it's becoming more and more obvious with schools not reopening and families not getting that funding and not getting any options. And you have other groups coming out and opposing them from getting additional options, which families are getting fed up with it, I think. And there are also families going to ACLJ. If you saw Jordan Sekulow on Fox News last night and a week ago, last Sunday, he was on 2 weeks in a row, telling families that you should come to us so we can represent you in court to take your states to court, because a lot of states have things called adequacy clauses in their state constitutions, whether it's a thorough and efficient education needs to be provided or an adequate education. It's really hard to say that you're doing that from the state's point of view if your schools are closed and you're not providing kids with an education.
And this is the American Center for Law and Justice?
Yep. And Jordan's their executive director, and they've reported hundreds of families have already in the last week, written inquiries to them from 22 different states. And I think Texas might have been one of those states as well.
Sure. And you coming from think tank world where we are very thoughtful, or try to be, before we talk about action, I would encourage anyone interested in that to flood the zone. I'm sure that the website is aclj.org. And I think that needs to happen because it is a legitimate concern we have on behalf of the millions of school children in this country. So Emily and Corey, let's pivot and take a couple of audience questions. We have several, probably won't have time to get to all of them, but we will work through them. And audience members, if you've got some questions for any of the three of us, just leave them there in the comments section and we'll get to them during the day. But the first question actually is a wonderful segue. And it is, where are we seeing private and or religious schools being allowed to reopen this fall? Emily?
In Texas, usually this is up to the private schools or the religious schools to decide. They often try to mirror the traditional school schedule, although they've got flexibility on that. This is an area that is not and should not be regulated by the state. It's not part of the state-provided system of education. So really, as far as I'm aware, schools across the state of Texas are allowed to reopen anywhere that these county orders aren't being handed down to try to force that, to try to keep that from happening.
Right.
So in general, they have the freedom to make their own decisions. That's being infringed right now because the public system doesn't want to reopen in many cases and is trying, therefore, to keep them from reopening as well.
And I should point out before turning to you, Corey, that our opinion is, for those of you in Texas, that the county orders, which have said that private non-religious schools should remain closed, actually contravene the governor's executive order to that effect from a month or so ago. So we're hoping for a little more clear guidance there. But if you're in Texas and a private school parent, including parent of a private school that does not have a religious affiliation, you ought to be opening on time, period. Corey, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, for the most part, private schools are able to reopen, but it obviously depends on the particular state. I called out Milwaukee, for example, earlier. They're not allowing private schools, but I think the norm is that private schools are able to reopen, especially religious schools like you're talking about in Texas.
Thank you. Well, moving on to another audience question, going back to micro schools. And a good question about standardized quality. What arguments are there for standardized quality in micro schools and similar entities? Corey?
Yeah, I don't think anybody really has a good answer as to what standardized quality actually looks like. And I don't think it looks like what we have on standardized tests. And I don't think we should try to recreate what we're doing in the public school system in the micro schools. I mean, families are seeking these alternative options for a lot of different reasons, but some of the reasons are that they don't like what's being provided in the public school system and they don't like standardized assessments. So I don't think we should require micro schools to have any standardized assessments, but I can see an argument to be made to, if you're going to have some type of program like a school choice program, perhaps that's one way to get it politically done, to have some type of assessment in place. But I personally think it's a bad idea to do it.
I'm going to propose that you're going to see some of that happen organically. If this continues to be popular among families, you're going to see organizations like Corey mentioned, Prenda, which is already a network of private of micro schools that exist, started in Arizona and spreading to other states. Some are getting established in Texas. The Acton Academy, founded in Texas, is starting to create these as well. You're going to start to see micro schools start to affiliate with each other and sort of create a brand presence, which will help signal to families, here are the quality standards that we provide. There is absolutely no reason why families couldn't either get together or individually as micro schools go ahead and take norm reference tests. They could try to take the STAR test if they wanted to, but there are testing options, or the CLT, the classical test that's also available if you've got a high school student who's looking at SAT or ACT options. There are testing options that exist for families who want that, who want to be measuring that quality. Absolutely possible. Teachers who are setting up micro schools could create quality metrics that they're going to use as well that can be agreed upon by families. I'd prefer to leave it open. Obviously, this is a pretty new and open landscape, so that can be hard for families to navigate, but there are definitely ways to do that. There are tests available. They can set up routines for their families. And then, of course, there's the potential for micro schools to begin to brand together and sort of develop what those quality metrics are going to look like for that system.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and to your point, Prenda already does, I believe, for most students require some type of standardized testing. So this could happen organically, and I think that's the main difference for me as well. Say again?
I was going to say most private schools do the same thing. They've already established what their quality controls are going to be. Most of them do some sort of nationally recognized testing to make sure that they're on par and their students are learning generally what we expect students to learn. In this country, it's just not forced. It's just not standardized as we think of it within the general government provided system.
Not to mention just the dissatisfaction, if not frustration, that I think a majority of American public school parents have with the number of days spent on standardized testing. I think that's something where liberals, conservatives, libertarians come together and agree. Certainly, I can tell you from a teacher standpoint, that's true. Nonetheless, having run a private school and being very familiar with the homeschool and microschool movement, there's always a desire by the teacher, by the parents, to understand the quality of what's happening there. And there are many instruments, from something that takes 2 hours, like the CLT-8, the Classical Learning Test 8, or other instruments. It's really vague for us to say the market handles it. What that means is parents and teachers figure that out. We ought to trust them to do it, because just to be really frank, the public school system hasn't figured it out. And we test more now, we spend more hours, we waste more hours of teachers and students on that than we ever have before, for diminishing returns.
And what's funny here, Kevin, is you mentioned that's absolutely true, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector as well. We hear complaints all the time from the public sector, from parents, teachers, administrators across the board. We really hate having to structure our school year around these standardized tests. We don't like the way that they affect us and our students. This year, we actually, the state had to cancel the STAR testing because of the way that schedule coincided with the pandemic and closures. It was just going to be infeasible to bring students in for that testing period. So that's going to be a one-time cancellation of that test. What was funny is you saw actually school districts, administrators, and teachers saying, wait, we need some kind of metric here at the end of the year, or at least the beginning of the next school year, to be able to see how we did, to be able to see how our students are doing and where to start with them. So TEA actually created sort of an unofficial STAR substitute for districts to voluntarily administer to kids at the end of the school year or at the beginning of next school year, so that they can have some kind of starting point. So tests aren't going away. It's just which tests and how we mandate them.
So one last question from the audience. It was a question that I was going to ask before we wrap up here. And for me, it's the pressing question, because chronologically it's first. All these others are very important. They all done a great job of answering them, and applaud the audience for the great questions. And it is about parents that have to work. We live in an era in American history when 2/3 of American households either have two wage earners, so mom and dad working outside the home, or they're single parent households. And one of the repercussions of that is that virtual schooling doesn't work. The kids need to be in school. And whether someone's liberal or conservative, they may have some longer term comments about that. But as I remind our wonderful think tank colleagues, this is a problem of now. This is what people, if you're in the audience and you're in that group, this is what you're worried about right now. I think about an article that ran in the San Antonio paper a few days ago. It's about a wonderful young lady, mom of two, Christina Noriega. She was elated, the article reads, to begin a new job in March. And as it turns out, her girls landed in schools of their choice, and then now they're not going to meet in person. So not only is that harmful to her girls, she cannot continue with this dream job. That's one example of literally millions. What do we do, Corey and Emily, to solve that in the next few weeks?
Well, and the situation is worse for some demographics than others, unfortunately. I was having a conversation with Richard Johnson the other day. Dr. Johnson is the director of our Booker T. Washington initiative. And he was mentioning to me, I may have this stat slightly wrong, but something around 70% of Black children are raised by single mothers. Mm-hmm. If anybody is going to be hit hardest by school closures or refusals to provide in-person instruction, whether that's a full closure or not, it's going to be those students who are already disadvantaged in so many other ways. And we're going to be putting them in the worst possible situation moving forward. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at and what we need to provide for families is what we've always needed to provide for families, which is choices and options so that they can make the best decision for their families. Right now, that looks like making sure that they have in-person options. Normally, that's not something we've had to fight for, but it is now. And it absolutely needs to be on the table for families. However we get them those options, they need to be provided. We're talking about not just children's social well-being or educational advancement, although those things are incredibly important. We're also talking about families' economic viability, the ability to survive, to live, to work, to thrive. A lot of things ride on families getting the educational services that they need, how they need them. So all we can do, the best thing that we can do is empower families to make those decisions for themselves, however they need to in this time of terrific upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Emily's totally right that, I mean, the basic answer to this is to fund families instead of the school system, have the money follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. There's a couple ways you can try to do this in Texas. So one, as I alluded to earlier, ACLJ is taking legal inquiries from families. And I just pulled up the map. There have already been families in Texas who are essentially taking legal battles to the state because the state is not providing an adequate or thorough or efficient education. And I believe the Texas Constitution has some of those words involved in their education where the state is supposed to provide some type of education to families. And if they're not doing that, well, families should be able to get their money back. And so that's one avenue that you can take in Texas to try to reach out to ACLJ. But then also you can look at what other states have already done, and other state governors have already, started to fund families using existing CARES Act funding to be able to give scholarships to families to send their children to private schools, or to either do that, or to offset the cost of home education or microschooling. And I'm looking at states like South Carolina just announced this today. I think it's about $30 million they allocated to families out of their CARES Act funding. It's not a lot, but it's a step in the right direction to it.
And it's more for South Carolina than it is in Texas.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one way to do it. Oklahoma's governor had a similar order. I think it's about $20 million. Again, it could be used to offset the cost of homeschooling expenses or microschooling, or it could be used for private school tuition and fees. Pennsylvania and Maryland both have legislation kind of on the table that they've proposed, different legislators in those states, to, again, do something similar to these other states like Oklahoma and South Carolina, to have the funding from the CARES Act that's already allocated to their states to follow the students to wherever they're getting an education. And so that could help, again, get families back on track. That's actually the name of the bill in Pennsylvania. It's called the Back on Track Education Scholarship Accounts. So I think that's the best way to do it. Florida's governor took a step in the right direction. He expanded their Gardner Scholarship Program for students with special needs. So perhaps, Texas can start to listen and, learn from these other states to, either use, the state legislature or the courts to try to empower families, like Emily was saying, so that they can have real options at this time. Because you're right, the families that are going to be hurt the most by this are the families that rely on two incomes, or single parent households that have to go back to work and provide for their families.
And Corey and Emily, what I hear when you tick off all of those examples, including in some states where the politics of school reform would not be the most advantageous for innovation, what I observe just as a historian and someone who's done public policy for a little while now is there is a tectonic shift underway. And the other side often likes to say, y'all need to be on the right side of history. Well, it seems more and more that we are. And we are, because we're on the side of kids and teachers, and it's time for the system and for policymakers to catch up. It's really time for legislators and members of Congress of both parties to have the civic courage to stand up for America's school children. So I just want to thank both of you for not just loudly and clearly saying that, but doing so in a way that's so cheerful, and I think has given our audience a lot of practical solutions. So as we wrap up here, Corey and Emily, just want to, as we always do, end with some encouraging words for our audience. This is a challenging year for all of us, regardless of our political dispositions, who we're voting for in the fall. But I think we want to remember that most of all, we're Americans together. We're going through something that is not just a historic time, but a very challenging one. So Corey DeAngelis, thanks for being with us. Just want to give you an opportunity to leave us with something hopeful.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, families already do have some types of options available at their fingertips. We have the internet available to reach educational resources at places like Khan Academy. You got Ron Paul homeschool curriculum. You have learneverywhere.org Facebook groups. And so you can, kind of seek out these resources to help you, educate your children. But then also you have other remedies that can be put into action in Texas. You can contact ACLJ to try to, get your education dollars back if the state's not going to provide your child with an adequate education. That's one way to go. And then another way to go is to, enact and expand some type of private school choice or education school choice, scholarship account program to offset the cost of homeschooling. So we have options on the table. And so I think that's encouraging to know that there are things that we can be doing to empower families. And then again, a lot of people have been calling the pandemic's only silver lining the fact that families are figuring out that the education system should not be structured the way that it is today. It shouldn't be funded the way it is today. The funding should go to families. It shouldn't go to a system that's not even serving the children. And so I think there's this huge paradigm shift in the minds of Americans and Texans, that they're starting to understand that the school system isn't set up in the right way, and that families are not getting a say in the matter, and they're being left out of the conversation. And so we could see a huge shift next year, and maybe even sooner, for people to push for school choice.
Thank you. Emily.
I think, again, the name of the day, the word of the day is choice. Districts can't be all things to all families. They're overextended trying to provide the perfect solution for everybody, and that's not going to be something that they're going to be able to do. So we need to empower administrators to offer what they do feel that they can offer well. We need to empower teachers to figure out what they're willing to do and best equipped to offer families and students. And then we absolutely need to, along with that, offer families and students the ability to choose what of those solutions is going to be the best one for them. Otherwise, we're just holding them hostage to the decisions of other people. So we absolutely need to provide choices at all levels to the people who are trying to figure out how to move forward in this new normal, which is the 2020-21 school year. And I think I would agree with Corey that there's a silver lining to this pandemic, which is that parents are realizing that they may not want to be entirely solely responsible for their child's education, as many have had to be over the spring, but they can, and they can have a lot more say over their child's education than they have in the past. And from what we're hearing in parent polls and surveys, parents are beginning to want that continued say in their child's education as they realize the way things have been going. They've had more involvement, and they're realizing that, you know, they don't have to be 100% in charge of all of this, but they do want to continue to be involved. And if that's something that we can maintain coming out of this pandemic, I think children will be well served, communities will be well served, and the country will be well served.
Indeed, I think both of you said it well. And so Emily Sass, my colleague here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, our good friend, Dr. Corey DeAngelis with the Reason Foundation, thanks so much for your time. You were fantastic. What I would say is that this has been a year of many challenges. We've had people on, it seems, every slot on the political spectrum tell us that this is the time for social change. I think what we've heard from our guests, Emily Sass and Corey DeAngelis, is that at the heart of that social change, the greatest need for change is our education system. And one of the many great things, the limitless number of great things about the United States of America is that it's common people, not the elites, who effect that change. And so if you've been inspired in some small way or some big way by this conversation today, maybe you're a parent, a grandparent, maybe you're a public school teacher who came into this conversation skeptical about what we were going to say. Now is the time. The train has left the station, and we happen to believe, because of our faith in this country and our faith in a higher power, that in this challenge also is a great opportunity, and we ought to go seize it. God bless you. God bless America, and God bless the great state of Texas. Y'all have a wonderful week. Thank you.